Hey guys, I'm Evan with ECS Tuning, and today we're reinforcing the rear axle carrier panel on a BMW E46 M3. If you own an E46, you've probably heard horror stories about the rear subframe tearing itself right out of the chassis. Today, we're tackling the issue head on. In this video, I'll walk you through the process of reinforcing the rear axle carrier panel to prevent costly failure. We'll cover everything from disassembly, prepping the chassis, reinforcing the underside with plates, bracing the top side, and reassembling the rear end with confidence. Whether your car is already showing signs of fatigue or whether you're being proactive, this is one of the most important jobs you can do to preserve the long-term integrity of your M3. So rear subframe reinforcement is a pretty labor-intensive job. You're going to need a ton of tools. Like all DIYs, as we come across each fastener, we'll call out the size for your reference. Specific callouts here, we have a 18mm socket, 17mm socket, 16, 14, 13, 10, and 8. You're also going to need a 7mm Allen socket and an E12 external torque socket. For wrenches, you'll need a big ol' 30mm wrench for the studs in the RACP. You also need a 14mm line wrench when we go to loosen up our brakes. And it helps to have a variety of flathead screwdrivers to use throughout the job. We're going to start by removing our wheels. This is a 17mm socket. All right, in order to get access to the rear subframe, we need to start by dropping the exhaust. I'm gonna loosen everything up for removal. I'm starting up here at section 1. We have an E12 external Torx and a 14mm wrench. Next up, we have 4 13mm bolts that hold the section 2 exhaust mount to the chassis. We're going to throw a pull jack under section 2 here, in front of the exhaust from sagging down when we pull this mount off. Next up, we have 3 16mm bolts that hold the V-brace to the chassis. Finally, we have 6 13mm nuts that hold our rubber exhaust hangers to the rear trunk floor. This is a really heavy exhaust, especially if you're pulling 1 through 3 all in one go. So I have Grant here with me to help. I'm gonna get these bolts out and we're gonna lift it down. Next up, we're going to remove this shield around the drive shaft. You should have about 5 fasteners here. My car is missing quite a few, so I only have these 2 at the front. They are 10mm. Oh no. That removed, we have a few more shields to get out of the way. We're going to have a variety of 8mm, 10mm, and push pins to remove these. Next up, we're going to loosen up the drive shaft at the flex disc. Next up, we're going to loosen the 6 E12 bolts that hold the rear of the drive shaft to the differential. Actually, if you saw when I tried to spin the bolts out of the rear of the drive shaft, it was spinning since we don't have the car in gear. What I'm going to do to fix that is I'm going to take a screwdriver, stick it in the vanes of the rotor between the caliper carrier and the caliper. That's going to stop it from spinning. Each time you need to rotate the drive shaft, just pull that out. When you got it where you need it, just stick it back in. Finally, we have two 13mm bolts that hold the carrier brace to the chassis. Next up, we're going to pull this 18mm bolt out of the trailing arm. That's going to allow us to lower the suspension down, yank this spring out so we don't lose it when we remove the subframe. Next up, using a 14mm line wrench, we're going to disconnect the brake line from the brake caliper. Next up, using a 7mm Allen, we're going to disconnect the brake caliper from the caliper bracket. Next up, using a flathead screwdriver, we're going to pull a cable clip. Now the cable can slide out. Next up, we'll disconnect our wheel speed sensor. It's located back here in this black plastic box. It's freed up from the chassis and it can come down with the trailing arm. On the right side of the car, we have another wheel speed sensor to disconnect, as well as the brake pad wear sensor. Next, we're going to disconnect our headlight leveling sensor. We take some persuasion, use a screwdriver to pry up on the connector. If your connector is crusty like mine, it may break at the side. I'll have to replace this, but I'll still get it out of the way of the subframe for now. Getting pretty close to getting the rear subframe out of this thing. We got a couple more things to do before we can start yanking bolts out of it. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect the parking brake cables from the handle. You can do this at the trailing arm, but I find that especially on a car in the rust belt, they're going to get stuck. It's easier to disconnect them and pull them out of the cable holders and drop the whole thing with the subframe. There are two 10mm nuts that hold the parking brake cables to the handbrake handle. Depending on your access, you can either use a 10mm wrench or you can use a 10mm deep ball socket. Back underneath the car, we can pull the handbrake cables out of their keepers. And then with a little persuasion, they should come out of these channels right here. So there are a variety of ways you can remove the rear subframe from your E46. The way I'm going to do it is with a table and a lift. I find that that's going to be the most efficient way to remove the subframe, especially since I'm replacing almost everything you see here. So we're going to lower it down onto the table, probably position it with some blocks to make sure it's not going to move around. Then we'll go around with the impact and we're going to loosen 4 18s around the subframe, 2 13s up in the push rod, and then we have 3 more on each side for the R-tabs. Once those are out, we can lift the car off the subframe and hopefully all goes well. All right, we're moving on to removing the fuel tank. Some people don't remove the fuel tank for welding on plates. However, we find that it's necessary, especially if you don't want to risk a fire or anything. Also, since I'm going to be grinding all the paint off and repainting underneath here, it'll be nice to have access to the front of the RACP. So right at the back here, we have a couple 6mm or flatheads for the fuel tank hose. Next we have 2 13s at the rear of the tank. Just pry the strap out of the way. So we've removed the rear subframe and the fuel tank from the vehicle. Finally, we have access to our 4 points for welding on RACP reinforcement plates. Our next steps are going to be to get some of these brake lines and fuel lines out of the way, and then we're going to use a wire wheel to sand down the undercoating and residual crud from around these points, and then finally we can get to welding. So we're here under the car. You saw me previously grind the factory undercoating off of these 4 points where the subframe attaches to. I'm sure by now you might know this part and this part. This whole area is called the rear axle carrier panel, commonly known as the RACP. So when someone says their subframe cracked, it's not exactly true. It's actually this part here, the trunk floor. You can see right here, this is where the gas tank would go. This is kind of underneath the rear seat, and this would be underneath the trunk. So due to rotational forces from the drive shaft and the axles, the 2 most common failures you'll have are this front right point here. As you can see, I have a crack right here that goes all the way up to about there. And then we also experience failure on the back. This one looks fine, but usually if your front right is cracked, your rear left will also be cracked. This is just because of the way the subframe twists due to movement from the axles and the drive shaft. These 2 get the most force. This one's pulled down and that one's pushed up. So that's usually where you'll see your cracking. These are our plates. They're part of the Turner kit. Hold it up here and you'll see that this is going to reinforce this area which is commonly cracked. So as you can see. So in a little bit, we're going to have Tali, our design engineer, come in here and burn these plates in for me. He'll talk a little bit about the prep he's doing with this crack right here, and then a little bit about how to weld the plug welds inside the plate and the perimeter welds around the plate.
All right, so here's the front right mounting point on Evan's E46. This is actually the only one that has a visible crack in it. So as you can see, we've got a crack going kind of front to back. What we're gonna do here before we weld the plate on is we're actually gonna drill tiny little holes at the ends of the crack. What that's gonna do is it's just gonna stop the crack from propagating. When a crack gets to kind of a circular hole, it's gonna stop because it needs some sort of stress riser to keep propagating. So we'll get those holes in there. We'll probably weld the crack up as best as we can and then grind it down flat. And then we're just gonna put the subframe reinforcement point right on top of that. So as you can see, we've got the other three done. We still need to do the rosette welds in these little holes here. All that's gonna do is it's just gonna give us a little bit more weld area. So around the outside, you go ahead and stitch weld it, and then you've got these holes in here where you can get some more weld area, and it just adheres the plate nicely to the RACP. So let's get it done.
On the time lapse, you saw me priming and painting and sanding, putting a ton of work after hours to get this ready to go. We're gonna start reassembly by putting in the gas tank. We're gonna start by throwing our straps in. With the fuel tank roughly into place, we can go ahead and reconnect the electrical connectors for the fuel pump and the level sender, as well as the various fuel lines that connect to the tank. The torque spec for the fuel tank strap bolts, as well as the one nut up top, is 14 foot-pounds or 19 Newton meters. Next up, we'll reconnect the two fuel hoses at the front of the tank. We have a push connect here and a rubber hose here. All right. We are finally ready to put the subframe back in the car. I've got it up on the transmission jack here. This is gonna help me steady it as I line it up. Before we put it in there, we're gonna check the studs in up front, gather the hardware for the rear, so we don't have to hold it up there for too long and figure out hardware. So the torque spec for these studs is 66 foot-pounds or 90 Newton meters. Obviously, like, you would need a really deep socket for it. I'm just gonna get it as tight as I can with this 30mm wrench. You can torque it if you desire. Start to raise our subframe into place. At the front of the subframe, we'll install our push rod. These plates here are included with the Turner Motorsport Rear Subframe Reinforcement Kit. These are going to space the push rod off of the chassis, which is necessary when you add the plates up top. Make sure you throw these in here while you still have room. And they'll align underneath with the 4 screws that hold the push rod to the chassis. The 4 bolts for the push rod are going to be 15.5 foot-pounds. So the subframe nuts at the front as well as the bolts in the back, those are both going to be 57 foot-pounds or 77 Newton meters. Next up, we're going to throw all the arms onto this subframe. As you can obviously tell by the beautiful black powder coat, this is not the original subframe from this car. I went through the process of taking everything off, getting it powder coated, and that's why we're assembling it piece by piece. If you dropped your subframe as a whole, like we did at the start of the video, obviously you can skip this part. We'll check back in when the subframe is assembled and we're ready to proceed. Now we are replacing our Guibo hardware. These are self-locking nuts, so you'll need to replace these when you remove it. Just got our drive shaft hoisted back up into place. Now we're going to torque everything down. Our drive shaft to output flange bolts are going to be 85 foot-pounds. Our CSB nuts are going to be 15 foot-pounds. And these rear ones here are going to be 59 foot-pounds. It is also important that you leave the CSB a little loose until you get these tight, and then you're going to preload the CSB by sliding it forward 4 to 6 millimeters before you tighten it down. That concludes our rear subframe reinforcement DIY. Links to all the products and kits we used are in the description below. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more enthusiast content.